To me, the truth is somewhere in between. These are often the stories that appeal to me, or stories where, I feel as though if you don't see the complications, then you're probably not thinking hard enough about the story.
As a reporter, Patrick Radden Keefe holds two disparate truths together with unparalleled skill. There are facts, and there's a story. In his work as a staff writer at The New Yorker, Keefe has showcased this talent in long-form articles ranging from Anthony Bourdain to the hunt for the drug lord Chapo Guzman. And in his nonfiction books, he has entranced a generation of readers. As Colin McCann wrote, quote, Patrick Radden Keefe uses the old Irish phrase, whatever you say nothing, to suggest and to say just about everything. Lauded as a master storyteller whose stories just happen to be true, Keefe brings us studies in enormous depth. He unearths stories that must be told, with every fact both a pickaxe and a vein of gold. I'm Rebecca Hoogs, the Executive Director of Seattle Arts and Lectures. You're listening to Sal on Air, a collection of talks from the world's best writers from over the 37 years that we have been bringing writers to Seattle and to you to share their life behind the book. Keefe joined us online in the summer of 2021 to discuss his recent best-selling books. And while there is no thrum and cheer of a crowded auditorium in this recording, Keefe's words bring all the light and crackle on their own. He shares how Say Nothing began when he read an obituary of an unknown woman, and he goes on to detail how his process for that book was not so different as he uncovered the moral bankruptcy of the Sackler family in Empire of Pain. Following the reading, Keefe is joined by fellow journalist Timothy Egan for a conversation on the Irish diaspora, Brexit, advertising and medicine, corruption, and more. As two investigative reporters, their conversation covers the political and social ramifications of publishing books on living people, who gets to have a good name, and, as always, how the story has changed us. This is Sal on Air.
Thank you so much, Tim. What a pleasure to be with you. And you're a journalist I've long admired, and so it's really a treat to be able to do this with you and with Seattle Arts and Lectures. Thank you so much for having me, and all of you for joining us. I thought what I would do is talk to you a little bit about the kind of journalism that I do. And then about these two books that Tim mentioned, Say Nothing, which I published a couple of years ago, and Empire of Pain, this new book, which just came out quite recently. So I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, which, if I'm honest, is a job that I've wanted ever since I was a kid. I started reading the New Yorker when I was in high school. My parents, we didn't always have a subscription, but sometimes they would have a subscription. I'd pick it up in the dentist's office, in the library of my high school. And so really my early aspirations to be a journalist and a writer were actually, in a kind of fantasy sense, were more specifically to write for the New Yorker. It took me a long time to operationalize this particular ambition, and I had a fairly circuitous route to journalism. I studied history in college and then went off to grad school in the UK for a couple of years and ended up actually going to law school. And it was when I was in law school that I started figuring out how it was that I might make a living as a writer. I started out writing books and then kind of backed into magazine writing, and eventually freelanced for the New Yorker and did that for about 6 years before going on staff full-time in 2012. And one of the things I love about the New Yorker as an institution, and there are other outlets like this, but not too many, is that it gives me the luxury of time and space to really report out a story and tell it in a comprehensive way, often at great length. So some of you may be chuckling. I tend to write the types of New Yorker stories that you start and you feel like they'll never end. And I always joke that, if you think it takes you a long time to read it, imagine how long it took me to write. I only do 3 or 4 pieces most years. And so there is this privilege to be able to go slow and think of the story as a story and how it wants to be told. I tend not to start with subjects. I tend to start with people. I think that there's something about us as humans. I mean, this would certainly be true for me, but I'm pretty sure I'm not alone, where whatever the issue, whatever the subject, it can be incredibly complex. But if I feel as though I am following characters, I mean, real people, but who are characterized in a certain way, and I'm sort of up close with them, I feel as though I understand them on some intimate level, I'll follow you anywhere. If you're telling me that story, I'll follow you through whatever thicket of complication you'd like. And for me, that's been an important vehicle. Something I noticed initially as a reader was that, if you're writing a story about quantum mechanics, my eyes will glaze over. But if you're telling me about some particular scientist or engineer and the way in which they personally are dealing with a problem, and in that manner, you kind of sneak in a lot of quantum mechanics, I enjoy it. I hardly notice the information that you're feeding me. So what that means is that when I'm looking for stories, I'm always looking first and foremost for stories, not for a subject that you're looking at from 30,000 feet, not even for a theme or a particular issue, but stories of people in conflict, stories of people making decisions. And I look for these stories all over the place. And Say Nothing is kind of a good example. This is a book that started with me just perusing the obituary page of the New York Times, which is one place that I often look for story ideas, because you'll see, a 1,200 word obituary of someone you've never heard of. And that's kind of perfect for me as a distillation of a world or a subject, in terms of the way you can just kind of crack open an individual human life and see where somebody came into the story and where they left it and what they did in between. And in 2013, I read an obituary of a woman I'd never heard of, whose name was Dolores Price. And she was the first woman to join the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, as a frontline soldier. So the IRA, for those of you who may not be familiar, was a paramilitary group that was involved in the cause of Irish independence. People who became a part of the IRA, like Dolores Price, believed that for hundreds of years, the British had been an occupying force on the island of Ireland, and they still controlled 6 counties in the north of that island. And members of the IRA believed that they had a responsibility, really, to try and expel the British by any means necessary. Dolores Price signed up when she was barely out of her teens in the early 1970s, at the outset of this period that we refer to as the Troubles, which is this kind of funny euphemism to describe what was really a 3-decade war, a conflict. It was never called a war. It was called a sort of civil disturbance, but it was a war. And what was most intriguing for me about Dolores Price in this obituary was the idea that when she was young, she felt the kind of headlong certainty of a young radical. She joined the IRA along with a number of other young people, including her own sister. And when they were young, there was no daylight between them. They believed that theirs was a righteous mission, And importantly, they believed that in order to carry it out, they would have to do some terrible things. So she joins the IRA and she almost immediately starts targeting people for execution, planting bombs in public places. She goes off in 1973 and leads a bombing raid to London where they bomb the Old Bailey and injure several hundred people. And she does these things not because she's a bloodthirsty psychopath, but because she has made a rational political calculation. And importantly, not a calculation that I would make, probably not a calculation that you would make. But she has a thought process and a kind of an ethical calculus where she says, for hundreds of years, my people have been trying to overthrow the British and drive them out once and for all. It hasn't worked. It's been this long history of failure. And if we are going to achieve what we want to achieve, what these generations that came before us failed to achieve, we may need to employ some means that, might otherwise seem like unethical means. We may need to do things that feel as though they violate our own kind of moral and social code, perhaps our religious code. But eventually we'll achieve what we want. We'll achieve this absolute end of driving the British out. And when we do that, we'll look back on those choices we made and they'll be justified in retrospect because they were means to an end. And the end was a righteous end. And in 1998, the Troubles end. You get this landmark peace agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, which is kind of a miracle of diplomacy in this grinding 3-decade conflict actually does resolve itself. And the IRA comes to the table in the person of Jerry Adams, this kind of complicated figure who you probably have heard of, who on the one hand is the kind of key representative of the Irish Republican movement, and on the other hand maintains that he personally was never in the IRA. But he steers the group to the negotiating table, and you get the Good Friday Agreement. And I grew up in Boston in an enclave that was fairly Irish American, and I had a sense in 98 that the Good Friday Agreement was just an unambiguous triumph. I think this is partially, there was a self-congratulatory sense that the United States had helped handmaiden this peace agreement. And so this was the way the story was told. But even in Irish America, I think there was a sense that, everything's great, everything's coming up roses now in Northern Ireland. And one of the things I was intrigued about in Dolores Price's story was that many people, like Dolores Price, who'd been involved on the front lines of the conflict, actually felt a great sense of dispossession when that peace deal happened. And it wasn't even necessarily because they wanted to continue fighting. Dolores Price had this kind of wild life. After she bombed London, she was caught. She went to prison. She and her sister went on hunger strike. She ended up getting down to about 75 pounds. It was close to death. And she was force-fed by the British government in order to keep her alive for 200 days. She ended up kind of going toe-to-toe with Margaret Thatcher in a contest of wills and prevailing, and was released from prison and married a movie star, Stephen Ray, who some of you may recall from The Crying Game and other great films. And she was really, by the time the peace happened, she was a kind of a middle-class, upper middle-class civilian, no longer involved in the armed struggle. But she was very traumatized by the way in which the peace came. And the reason for this was that it was a negotiated settlement. So all those years she had said, I did these awful things, but I did them as a means to an end. And when the peace deal comes, the Brits don't leave. The decision is essentially that Northern Ireland will remain part of Great Britain, part of the UK. that eventually, if someday you have a situation in which a majority of people put it to a vote and want to reunite with the Republic of Ireland in the South, then they will. But before that time, those 6 counties will remain part of the UK. For Dolores Price, this was incredibly upsetting because there was this sense that suddenly the rationale that she had used to justify those things she did had been taken away from her. And she said, wait a second, you've kind of changed the game here. You know, I did those things back in the early 1970s with this very absolute political ambition. But of course, the nature of, you know, a peace deal and the end of a conflict is compromise. And so there was this dissonance between the kind of purity of her objectives as a young woman, and then the fraught, imperfect nature of any compromise that would lead to a peace agreement. This was compounded for Dolores Price because the person who was very closely associated with this peace deal was Gerry Adams. And as it happened, Gerry Adams had been in the IRA. It was quite convenient for him to say that he hadn't, because if you think about it, when you have people like Bill Clinton or Tony Blair negotiating with him, you know, they could, if they were accused of negotiating with terrorists, they could say, well, you know, but I'm not negotiating with terrorists. I'm negotiating with Gerry. And Gerry wasn't in the IRA. Gerry's not a terrorist. So there was this sort of ambiguity, which politically was quite helpful for Adams. But for somebody like Dolores Price, this was maddening. Not least because when Gerry Adams was in the IRA, he had been her commanding officer. So a lot of those awful things that she went off to do, she had done because he gave the orders for her to do so. And then you get this situation in which, in middle age, she's reeling from trauma. She developed a drinking problem. She was abusing prescription pills. And she's literally seeing visions of people who she knew who died, whose deaths she was involved in. You know, there's a moment in the book where she's driving. One of her sons is sitting in the back seat, and she looks in the rearview mirror, and suddenly she sees the face of this former friend who she drove to his death because the IRA told her to. And so she ends up with all this trauma, this feeling of moral injury, that she no longer has a place to put those transgressive things that she did when she was young. And the person who gave her the orders, Gerry Adams, is kind of disowning her. He's saying, well, you know, I don't have any trouble sleeping at night because, you see, I was never in the IRA. And it kind of drives her mad. So there's much more to the book. There's the story of another woman, Jean McConville, who was a very different kind of person. She was a widow, a mother of 10. She lived in West Belfast. And one night in 1972, she was abducted in front of her kids, pulled out of the house at gunpoint, and never seen again. And it turns out that Dolores Price had something to do with that abduction and disappearance back in 72. And I was intrigued by the idea that you could tell the story of these two very different women, one of them a victim, one of them a perpetrator, and use that as a lens through which to look at the whole sweep of the Troubles. There's also an oral history project, this secret oral history project at Boston College, after the Good Friday Agreement, in which people who'd been involved in the Troubles kind of came forward and told their story at great length, with the understanding that the transcripts would not be released until after they had died. And Dolores Price, it turns out, took part in that project. And so suffice it to say, when word came out that she had done so, and that she might have talked about the abduction and murder of Jean McConville in 1972 in those recordings, and that she might have suggested the person who gave the orders for that abduction and murder was none other than the architect of the peace process, Gerry Adams, that really led to a kind of spectacular unraveling, which I chronicle in the book. So it's funny, you know, with Say Nothing, it was a project very much, in my mind, about moral ambiguity. I felt as though the story of the Troubles had often been told in a slightly caricaturish fashion, that when you read books about the Troubles, there's often quite a strong point of view. And there's a kind of Manichaean valence to these stories, where, just to take Jerry Adams as an example, there are often accounts in which Jerry Adams is regarded either as kind of a saint, a sort of a Nelson Mandela of Northern Ireland, a guy who should have won the Nobel Prize, or alternatively as just an absolute antichrist, a silver-tongued devil who has no redeeming features whatsoever and was an agent of death and destruction in the IRA. And to me, the truth is somewhere between. These are often the stories that appeal to me, or stories where I feel as though if you don't see the complications, then you're probably not thinking hard enough about the story. And so with Say Nothing, what I wanted to do was tell it. I was glad that Tim mentioned novels, because I think a lot about this, but I wanted to be close enough to these characters that it would be hard for you to form easy judgments about them. And you might even begin to feel implicated yourself, where you feel kind of so close that you're rooting for them at times, and then they'll do some appalling thing. And to the degree that you came out of the book having maybe reevaluated some of your own assumptions, that would be satisfying for me, because the process of writing it and the, I think, innate complexity of these people and events made a very powerful impact on me as I was writing the book and thinking about these stories. Before Say Nothing had been published, I had already started work on this next book. And this is a little glib, but I joked to my wife as I got going on it that if Say Nothing was a story all about moral ambiguity, this new project, Empire of Pain, is very much about moral clarity. On the surface, it's a very different kind of story. In 2017, I wrote an article in the New Yorker about the Sackler family. And this was a family that had chiefly been known, I think, up to that point as a great philanthropic dynasty. They had, a kind of base of operations in the New York, Connecticut area, and then another in London, and had given hundreds of millions of dollars to the arts and the sciences. There are Sackler galleries, Sackler wings, Sackler lecture halls at the Metropolitan Museum, at the Guggenheim, at the Louvre, at the British Museum, at Oxford University, at Harvard, at Columbia. The list goes on. And what was less well known about the Sacklers until fairly recently was the source of this wealth. There was a tendency, I think, to see them as almost a kind of a great dynasty whose fortunes had been made in the 19th century, when in fact, the vast bulk of the family fortune was made just in recent decades through the sale of OxyContin, a very powerful painkiller, which many observers who've looked closely at this issue believe gave rise to the opioid crisis. So there are many, many prescription painkillers that were involved in the opioid crisis, but OxyContin was kind of the tip of the spear. So I wrote this big piece in the New Yorker where I was looking pretty closely at the family. The family had been written about before, most notably in a book about OxyContin called Painkiller by the New York Times journalist Barry Meyer, which was published in 2003. And by a great book called Dreamland about the opioid crisis, which by Sam Quinones, and came out, I think, in 2015. But I noticed that the Sacklers always seemed to occupy one strand in a tapestry. When people told their story, it was usually, you'd have a story about doctors and Purdue Pharma and investigators, and you'd have some characters who were struggling with addiction, and then there'd be this thread, which is the Sacklers. And I was trying to figure out, how is this not caught up with them? How is it that all of these institutions of higher learning and these world famous art museums keep taking their money, keep putting the Sackler name on things? And this at a time when, many other institutions are taking names down. I thought about the fact when I was working on the piece that Yale University had renamed Calhoun College because the Calhoun that it was named after had been a great proponent of slavery. And I was just wondering, how is it that there are these Sackler facilities at Yale, and that's not an issue in the way that the Calhoun name is. And so what I set out to do was write a piece where the family was really front and center. There was kind of nowhere to hide because they were center stage. And the piece came out, and it was one of these strange ones where it, sometimes you write a story and it just kind of describes the world. I'd say most of the time that's been my experience, and hopefully you describe it well. And then very infrequently, you write a story and it kind of changes the story. The fact of the piece itself changes the narrative. And for a whole bunch of reasons, I think that New Yorker story about the Sacklers had an impact. It did have the effect of thrusting them into the spotlight in an uncomfortable way. Nan Golden, a very famous, celebrated photographer, read the piece when she was in recovery for an OxyContin addiction. And she decided to use her stature in the art world to stage a series of incredible demonstrations at places like the Met and the Guggenheim and the Louvre, and really carry out a kind of it was almost a throwback. I mean, a real kind of old school protest movement to try and get these institutions to take down the Sackler name. So I thought at the time about trying to write a book, and here's a connection between these two works. I had a feeling, part of what had been so satisfying for me about Say Nothing is that even though none of the chief characters, it's really got 4 central characters, none of them were people I had a chance to speak to. 3 of them were dead by the time I started writing, and the 4th, Jerry Adams, refused to speak to me. I felt as though through reporting, I was able to tell the story in a way that would feel kind of novelistic and intimate enough that you, the reader, wouldn't constantly feel kind of distracted by my lack of access, taken out of the story by my lack of access. There's a bunch of ways that I've devised over the years where you can kind of, put together a little compost heap of scraps of reporting that you can find, other interviews people have given, oral histories, interviews with people who knew them, memoirs, whether they're published or unpublished, anything that you can, letters, diaries, and you put together all this material, and ideally you can tell the story in a way where they feel vivid as characters. And initially I thought I couldn't do that with the Sacklers. I worried that if I were to write a book about them, that it was all fine for a magazine article, but a book, you would feel as though you were seeing them in some high tower through a telescope, which to me would not be very satisfying. I don't think as a reader I would find that very satisfying. And as a writer, it just was not something I was particularly inclined to do. What changed? Well, there were 2 things that changed. The first is that this is now the 3rd book that I've written that's grown out of a New Yorker piece. And one wonderful kind of unexpected benefit when I publish these pieces is I think of it as a little bit like shining the bat signal up at the sky, where there are all these people who, when the piece comes out, come out of the woodwork. They find me. These are often people who, I certainly didn't speak to them when I was working on the piece. I might not have even known to look for them. But after this Sackler piece came out, all these people started getting in touch with me saying, I know the Sacklers, or, this Sackler was my neighbor. This Sackler was my college roommate. I worked for the Sacklers for years and years. And so I started getting these incoming messages. And then the other big thing that happened was that the Sackler's company, Purdue Pharma, which has now pled guilty twice to federal criminal charges that they have over-promoted OxyContin and really downplayed how addictive it is. The company's been subject to many, many, many lawsuits, thousands of lawsuits. But in 2018, 2019, after my piece came out, Maura Healey, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, who is a big character in the last third of this book, she did something that nobody had done up to that point. She sued not just the company, but individual members of the family who had sat on the company's board and presided over a lot of the decision-making during this period of time when we now know the company was committing felonies. They had also benefited tremendously from this. They'd taken billions and billions of dollars out of the company. So she sued these individual Sacklers. And when she did, she had access to a huge trove of internal documentation, private emails, board minutes, all kinds of really rich and revealing information that showed the individual Sacklers, showed the way in which they behave and relate and communicate behind closed doors. So those two things came together to make me feel that there was a way to tell this story, even if the family wouldn't cooperate with me, that would be really compelling. And frankly, I also felt a little bit of a, it's an old-fashioned way to talk about this stuff, but I felt a certain moral imperative to try and tell the story, because as I pushed into this, I discovered that there's this rich and fascinating history with the Sackler family. I didn't really want to tell a story just about Big Pharma and OxyContin and the opioid crisis. What I wanted to do was tell a kind of multi-generational family saga. And the original three Sackler brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond, were these three doctors who had grown up in Brooklyn during the Great Depression. Their family, they came from an immigrant family. Their parents had come from Europe. And they were both physicians, but also businessmen, and very, very entrepreneurial. And starting in the 1950s, they really began to kind of mingle the worlds of medicine and commerce in a way that I think was foundational and really significant, and also quite dangerous. And so there's this sense in which this earlier generation had kind of created the world in which OxyContin could end up doing what it did. And Arthur Sackler, who's really the patriarch and kind of the major figure in the first third of Empire of Pain, I think of him as sort of the Don Draper of medical advertising. He had his own medical advertising firm in the 1950s and 60s, and he made the first great Sackler fortune marketing Valium, another addictive drug, which Roche developed and sold. And Arthur designed the whole marketing campaign for Valium and was compensated very lavishly for his efforts. But so the Sacklers, going back generations, had always excelled really more than anything else at marketing, at salesmanship. And as I got into it and I looked at even the history of the family's philanthropy dating back to the 1950s, there was this strange tendency to put the Sackler name on museum wings and universities, but not on the family business. So Purdue Pharma was originally called Purdue Frederick. It was not named after the family. Arthur Sackler would often obscure the ways in which he made his business. There were all kinds of contemporaries of his who had no idea that he'd been involved in Valium. And so I thought that there was a kind of an imperative when you look at this great con that the family engineered, in which they succeeded in writing the family out of the history of the family business, for me to try and put them back into it and to do it in a book. And it was an intense process. I had to do a huge amount of research, but there were tens of thousands of pages of documents that I ended up getting access to. And I interviewed over 200 people who'd worked at the company, who'd worked for the family, in order to try and paint this portrait of three generations of the Sacklers. Something I think about a lot as a writer is the idea that I tend to be somewhat obsessive about reporting and researching these books, but I think as I've gotten older, I've realized that there's a dangerous tendency there when you go off and you do all that homework to kind of push the homework across the table at the reader and say, look at all this homework I did. And that can be pretty deadly. As a reader, I find that pretty deadly when, when the writer says, and now 3,000 words on the history of the tea trade, because I read all these books and I want to show you what I've learned. And so a lot of it for me is actually the discipline of absorbing all that material and understanding it myself, but then being pretty selective about what actually goes into the book, and always having considerations of character and narrative momentum and focus really front of mind, because part of the point for me was to write a book that somebody who has no interest in the opioid crisis or in the history of big pharma or medical advertising or philanthropy in the art world might pick up and just find that the undertow of the story is enough to pull you in. I'm just going to end by talking very briefly about where we are now. So the Sacklers, as Tim suggested in his introduction, were not crazy about this book. They never talked to me. They've been threatening to sue me since before I started writing. There's a story I tell at the end of the book about a period of time last summer when there was a private investigator staking out my house. None of this was fun. And in the background, you've had this amazing thing happening where Purdue Pharma, the company that the family owns, ended up pleading guilty a second time to federal criminal charges just a few months ago in late 2020. And we now know that in the interim between the 2007 guilty plea and the 2020 guilty plea, the Sacklers were quietly pulling billions and billions of dollars out of the company. They ended up taking $10+ billion out of the company during this time. And eventually the coffers are getting emptier and emptier and emptier. And they're down to, their last billion. And the Sacklers say, well, geez, we see there's all these lawsuits now. Almost every state in the union is suing the company. Too bad, no money left. And they kick the company into bankruptcy. So we're now in this kind of crazy situation where there's a bankruptcy proceeding for Purdue. The Sacklers are sitting on the sidelines of that, having pulled more than $10 billion out of the company. They're not facing any criminal charges themselves. And they've got a proposal where they would pay about $4 billion to help remediate the opioid crisis, not acknowledge any wrongdoing, and shield themselves from any future lawsuits related to this stuff. So I end up in this kind of tricky situation in which the ending of the book, I think in some ways will be quite unsatisfying for people emotionally. And yet, to me, this is also very much a story about impunity and about the way in which the super elite are able to compromise our systems of regulation and of justice. And the bad guys, I'm afraid, often get away with it in the end. There's one interesting moment, though, in the book, this anecdote that I stumbled on, which is about the original patriarch, Isaac Sackler, who had come over from Europe and had these three sons. And at the height of the Great Depression, Isaac Sackler loses everything. And he gathers his sons to him, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond, and he tells them, listen, I'm not going to be able to pay for your education. I really have nothing to give you. But there's one thing I have given you, and it's the most important thing that a parent can give their child. I've given you a good name. And to Isaac Sackler, what that meant is a name that means integrity, right? It stands for something, a name as a badge of honor. And I think that actually explains why the Sacklers for generations have kind of put the name up all over the place. But it also sets the stage for where we are now. So Isaac Sackler said to them back during the Depression, if you lose a fortune, you can always go out and earn another one. But if you lose your good name, you can never get it back. And so this to me is the kind of overwhelming irony of where we end up in the Sackler story, is that the family chose to keep the fortune, but in the process, they sacrificed their good name. And I don't think that they will ever get it back at this point. I want to thank you all for joining me, and I'm really excited to talk with Tim now. Thank you.
We'll return for the rest of the event with Patrick Radden Keefe in a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you about an event coming up with Michelle Norris on February 4th. For decades, Michelle Norris has been at the heart of American journalism, with her role as host for NPR's flagship radio show, All Things Considered, from 2002 to 2011. And in 2010, she began the Race Card Project, in which she invited people to share their thoughts about race. It is this groundbreaking endeavor that made her book, Our Hidden Conversations, possible. Tickets are available now for both in-person and online attendance at lectures.org. And now, more from Patrick Radden Keefe.
Let me start with Say Nothing. You write about these hatreds that are centuries old. I remember there's that Sean O'Casey line, the playwright. He said, we don't forget them things. If they've taken everything else from us, they've left us our memory. Anytime you write about Ireland, you're always struck by how the past is so present. You're Irish American. Did you feel you had to sort of be consciously detached from that story to tell that story, that you had to sort of get rid of whatever tribalism you may still have on this subject?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, it's a weird one. I am Irish American, but maybe less so than I might appear. I mean, my father's family came over a century ago, and I did grow up in Dorchester in Boston, where there are a lot of kind of professional Irish Americans. That was an environment that I grew up and came to know well. But I'm not. It may be that just instinctively I'm not much of a joiner. So I always felt a little alienated from the the kind of Blarney Stone, Shamrock, corned beef and cabbage, St. Patty's Day culture. A part of this is that I had a very good friend who was Irish from when I was fairly young, and I could tell from him that there was a real distinction between the people who I grew up with who would say, I'm Irish, and then this person who's actually Irish. I mean, I think this is probably true for almost any kind of diasporic group that takes hold. An Italian American from Philadelphia, whose family's been in the Philly area for 100 years, they have some cultural affinities with someone from modern day Naples. But there are also many ways in which these cultures have diverged. And as I say in the book, I mean, there are far more Irish Americans than there are people on the island of Ireland, right? We are our own distinct culture. So I didn't actually feel as though I needed to kind of deprogram or be more objective. I did think that I thought that my name would be a tell. I thought it would be a thing I'd have to explain. And I would say, oh, my family on my father's side was from Donegal and yada, yada, yada. It never came up. When I was over there, it never came up. There was a sense that I was an outsider. I was an American. I was like a foreign correspondent.
So I want to talk about the reaction over there after your book came out. One of the really interesting things, and you touched on this, Patrick, in your conversation, was how Gerry Adams, who's in some circles is, considered saintly, and like in other circles is a monster, but he and the IRA really have blood on their hands from this killing and from others. And this, the peace process sort of polished that all over. As a result of this book, was there any sort of forced, because Sinn Féin now is very active. That was the group that came out of the IRA, the political arm, but very active in Northern Ireland's politics. They have seats in the parliament. They're pretty much running the show, or they're in a driver's seat position. Does your book have any, did the reaction to your book do anything to change the way people look at these groups, to look especially at Adams himself?
I mean, I think yes, though maybe not to a point where it would hurt Sinn Féin politically. I know that he's been asked a lot about the book and has been silent about it, and I'm sure that to him it feels like a piece of gum that's stuck to his shoe. I think it probably won't go away. It's been read widely enough, even over there, that I think he'll probably be asked about it from time to time, or some wag on Twitter will respond to him and link to something I've written. But honestly, I actually think that the greater impact for him, the sense in which the book may have occasioned some discomfort, is that over there, I mean, in Ireland, notwithstanding the incredible success of Sinn Féin as a political party in both the north and the south of Ireland over the last decade, people over there, I think had fewer illusions about Gerry Adams. The real surprise for me was here. So to go back to your earlier question, I thought Irish Americans would be very, very skeptical of this book because I think that the myths that I like the way you put it about how the peace process cleaned it up. And I think that the mythology around Adams has always been easier to sustain in Irish America than it has in Ireland, North or South. And something that frankly really shocked me, and I think it's probably less a reflection on the brilliance of my book and more just a reflection on the passage of time, is that as I went out on tour, I would hear from people who would say again and again and again, you really fundamentally changed the way I saw this guy. I realized basically that I had been imbibing a kind of mythology. And this is Irish Americans who were who read the book widely and reacted to it in a way that was candidly, a little less defensive than I thought it would be, and a little more open to the idea that maybe it's time for a reconsideration of Adams and his legacy.
So I would just include myself as an Irish American who felt that way. Your book certainly changed my view of Adams, and it was quite an awakening. So you're a storyteller, which is one of the best ways to approach these books. But I want to ask you for just a moment to put on your sort of prognosticator's hat. With Brexit in the UK, you essentially have a de facto wall down the Irish Sea, which is what people in Northern Ireland didn't want. We've had some turbulence. Some people are saying the Troubles are coming back. This is mostly coming from the Northern Ireland faction. There's been some burnings, some semi-violent demonstrations. Do you see the Troubles coming back and Brexit being that, or do you see perhaps all of this leading to the inevitable vote that will lead to a united Ireland? I mean, I want to address the short term and then long term.
Yeah, I mean, in the short term, look, it's been a very upsetting couple of months in Northern Ireland. And I always say, be careful prognosticating about Brexit because nobody really knows how it's going to break. And to be honest with you, to the degree that I was doing any tentative prognosticating over the last couple of years, it hasn't worked out the way I thought. You were going to get a hard border between the North and the South, which would inflame Irish nationalists, and that was the way things would break. And instead,
would accelerate basically the breakdown of the borders.
Yes.
Yeah.
Instead, we get the border in the Irish Sea, which is obviously very upsetting to Unionists and Loyalists. I don't think the Troubles are coming back. I think that the conditions that existed in the 1960s and 70s just aren't there anymore, and I don't think there is a kind of widespread appetite for anything like that. So I think the good news is that what we're seeing is largely a marginal thing, even if it's very upsetting. And I would also add that I think, having spent quite a bit of time over there, not in the last year, but up till the last year, I think a lot of this is actually about young people who don't have great opportunities. They can't really see a future that they can get very invested in. When you get out there on the streets, as I've done this once, where I was there in July during the marching season, and there's bonfires and riots in the streets, and I was out and about, and a lot of these young people out there lighting the fires, these are not scholars of the political history of Irish independence. It's more like soccer hooliganism. There is a deeply tribal sense of animus that I don't think is all that informed by the kind of political or historical stuff. So the good news is I don't think the troubles are coming back. In terms of the long-term consequences, it's hard for me to imagine. I mean, you tell me. I'd be very interested to hear your views, but it's hard for me to imagine that you don't end up eventually with a vote for a united Ireland. I think that the genius of the Good Friday Agreement, and please don't interpret anything I said in my remarks to be, it was imperfect, but all peace agreements are imperfect. It was a brilliant agreement, and it created this constructive ambiguity where Northern Ireland could be part of the UK and part of Europe. You could have passports for the UK and for Ireland. The EU sort of cushioned all of this. There were huge subsidies. There was trade going back and forth. They could have it both ways. And the weirdness of Brexit, and I would argue the kind of self-defeating aspect of Brexit, is they say, no, you have to choose. And I do think that if you force a choice, it's very hard for me to imagine people in the North ultimately choosing the UK over Europe.
Mm-hmm. So also, the Republic has to say in that as well. And there's a lot of people in the Republic of Ireland who feel like the people who live in the North are just too politically conservative on things like abortion, on gay rights, on things like that. There's some people in the Republic who say, we don't want the 6 counties in. So we don't, there is that side as well.
Yeah.
So I love the way you phrase this, Patrick, that one of the books is about moral ambiguity and one of the books is about moral clarity. I'm going to turn to the book about moral clarity on the Sacklers. And you really brilliantly sort of detail what, even though these 3 founding fathers were doctors, what great marketers they were. And these marketing skills they brought to something that hadn't had marketing skills before. So could you tell us about some of the things, you call them the Don Draper, of medicine. Can you tell us about some of the things they actually pioneered or pushed the envelope in pushing oxy? And also in earlier pushing Valium as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was
using the word pushing. I guess I shouldn't say that.
You're not. No, pushing is not an inappropriate word. I mean, I think that's just the word. Arthur Sackler, who was really, his brothers were very brilliant in their own way, but I think Arthur was a genius. And he kind of came into his timing was very good. So he gets into the business, the business of pharmaceutical advertising during the era of the wonder drug. So you've had penicillin, becomes this huge thing during the Second World War, and then you get these kind of newly emboldened pharmaceutical companies just inventing a new drug every week. And the issue becomes, how do we roll these out? How do we have product differentiation? And what Arthur did in the first instance was just take the kinds of techniques that were already being used to sell cigarettes or cars or bathing suits and import them into the world of pharmaceuticals. And so it's, really brilliant graphics. I tell a story in the book about how, a young Andy Warhol was one of the artists that they had who would come in and do designs. And then Arthur's biggest thing, I think, is that he realized that the consumer is not actually your ultimate target. Your ultimate target is the doctor. So Arthur was capable of a lot of contradictions, let's say, generously. So he had a notion of the physician as this kind of priest-like role in society, unimpeachable, morally upright, you couldn't put one over on a physician. And he would say, no physician would be swayed by something like an advertisement. And yet at the same time, this is a guy who
Right.
owned and ran a advertising agency geared toward physicians. And so he kind of did this thing where he was both playing up the notion that physicians could never be influenced, and then influencing them in a wide variety of ways. So, he would get endorsements from doctors, and sometimes they were real doctors. Sometimes it turns out they were fake doctors. The story I tell in the book about an advertisement for a drug that I think was a Pfizer drug, actually. And there's a bunch of business cards of doctors who supposedly endorse it. And there was a journalist for the Saturday Review who just calls the phone numbers on the business cards. Turns out the doctors don't exist. So he did some flagrantly deceptive stuff like that, but then kind of overplaying the therapeutic benefits of the drugs, underplaying the downsides, and doing it all in this kind of highly clinical way where you're kind of always referring in a very self-important way to the medical literature, backing up what you're doing. And so it allows for this kind of aura of self-importance that I think papers over the conflicts of interest. And I'll give you just one example, actually, from the Purdue Pharma context that kind of carries this idea through. If you know physicians, if you've talked to them about this, I certainly have had these conversations with doctor friends. They'll say, oh, well, of course the pharma companies are always trying to influence us, but I would never be influenced in my prescribing by the pharma. I sort of see what they're doing, but I don't fall for it. And to me, this is, again, that kind of Arthur Sackler idea of the sort of myth of the unimpeachable physician. So, you ask them about meals and they'll say, oh, well, they come and there's a junket, they buy it, they buy me a steak dinner, but it's not like you buy me a steak dinner and I want to change the way I prescribe. So Purdue Pharma at a certain point starts spending $9 million a year just to buy food for doctors. And I tell this story in the book about how they knew the return on investment they were getting down to the doctor in terms of the way in which those prescribing habits really did change. So this is the kind of arsenal of influence that they put into force.
I had that very conversation with my doctor, who's also my running partner, and he said the same thing as, oh, they always say they'll take us to dinner, but that's not going to sway my opinion. And then he said, having just read your book, he was really disappointed at how many of them have just easily caved. So that goes to my next question. There are lots of little corruptions and big corruptions as OxyContin is released in 1995. I want to remind people its active ingredient is the chemical cousin of heroin, twice as powerful as morphine. But, you have the FDA sort of looking the other way in one sense that one FDA member goes to work for the Sacklers. And you have these doctors essentially being bribed. And then the Sacklers also hide behind this argument of the democratization of pain medication, that they're doing something for the people who don't necessarily have cancer, but have everyday aches and pains. Tell us about these little and big corruptions that went in making this a mega drug.
Oh, there were so many of them. It's great to hear you describe it in those terms, because this is something I really wrestled with, is I think the thinking about the varieties of corruption and the kind of soft corruption. And you see this again and again, where this is all playing out in a professional milieu where people have compliance departments and they're aware that there are rules and laws. And so I think part of what's hard is you're never talking about a suitcase full of money pushed under a table. The flavor of the corruption is more sophisticated than that and more subtle than that. And I actually think it kind of evolves over the decades to create a kind of like a zone of deniability for these people, because they all sort of know well enough that they need to be able to tell a story about what's happening. So you're quite right. I mean, the FDA examiner who approves OxyContin, and doesn't just approve the drug, but approves the specific ways in which it can be marketed. Shortly after approving the drug, he decides he's going to leave government, and he goes off and works at another pharmaceutical company for a year. And then he goes and works at Purdue Pharma. at a salary that is 3 times what he was making in the government, about $400,000 his first year. And there's a deposition in which Richard Sackler, who's one of the key Sacklers in this story, talks about this guy, Curtis Wright, who went to work at Purdue. And he said, oh yeah, he called us about a job before he'd even left the FDA, but I thought that probably wouldn't look good for us to give him a job when he just approved our drug. But what is funny, and just to get to my point about the kind of soft corruption of the way, is that Richard Sackler clearly, so he says, so he went away for a year to another company, and then he came and worked for us. And clearly, these are like smart, educated adults who clearly said, okay, so the first scenario, that he goes directly from the FDA to come work for us, that's not kosher. But after a cooling off period of a year, that should be just fine. There's any number of things. To go to your point about it being oxycodone, there's to me still one of the most shocking things I discovered is the Sacklers and Purdue had a prior drug, MS-Contin, which was also a painkiller. It was a morphine-based drug, chiefly for cancer pain, and it had been a big hit. And they decided that with OxyContin, which was oxycodone, different chemical, they wanted it to expand it so that it's not just for severe pain, but for back pain, sports injuries. It's for moderate pain, non-malignant pain. And that's a much bigger market. So of course there are commercial reasons why you might want to do that. And as they're doing their focus groups, they realize that physicians believe erroneously that oxycodone is weaker than morphine. It's not. It's about twice as strong. And there are these emails, I actually have the emails, I quote them in the book, in which these senior executives, and Richard Sackler is part of these conversations, these senior executives say, let's not do anything to make the doctors realize they're wrong about our drug. Let's let them keep thinking it's weaker than morphine. Because if they do, they're more likely to prescribe it to a wider range of people. So I don't know if that's big corruption or little corruption, but I find it staggering.
Yeah, it really is. So I particularly really like the portrayal of Arthur, this sort of oddball founder of one of the 3 brothers. I've talked to some other people who said, well, it takes a while to get into the meat of it. I really liked his backstory because he was such a strange guy. I mean, he's compelling, fascinating, charismatic, multiple married, but he advised his children. There's a great quote. This goes to sort of Greek tragedy aspect, Patrick, of your book that you talk about. He advised his children just before his death, quote, leave the world a better place than you entered it. Now, and I'm giving a conservative estimate here, some 500,000 deaths attributed to OxyContin overdoses, opioid-related overdoses, I'm sorry, which is about 100,000 less than have died of COVID so far. How do you suppose that sort of statement squares with all the children and grandchildren underneath him? Leave the world a better place, and you've got 500,000 people dead from overdoses. I mean, how does that squaring that moral ambiguity work there?
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad to hear you say that about Arthur. The biggest creative decision in the whole book was to devote a third of it to Arthur Sackler, and I feel very good about that decision.
Well, he's a strange enough character that you really want to follow him too.
Yeah, but he's also not he's not the kind of random eccentric cousin. I mean, the reason that I did that is that there's almost everything in what comes later has a predicate in the Arthur Sackler story. That so much of what ends up happening with OxyContin actually kind of repeats these patterns that Arthur initiated. And one of them was a kind of obsession with legacy. So there was, from that early generation, a sense of the legacy of the family, a huge amount of kind of self-mythologizing about their role. And I've read all these letters and I interviewed all these people who worked with Arthur back in the 50s, and there's a kind of grandiosity. It's like a register of speaking and thinking and writing that you very rarely encounter anymore. But there was this sense that to use a line that's not in the book, but something I thought about a lot. There was that Steve Jobs line about wanting to certain people put a dent in the universe. And I feel as though the fascinating thing is that so many of the Sacklers thought in precisely those terms. I want to put a dent in the universe. They thought of it as a good dent. And so to me, there is great tragedy in the idea that along the sort of specific lines that they articulate, like these, the don't lose the good name, leave the world a better place than you came into it. They're the ones who articulate the kind of the frame of the tragedy that the family then proceeds to enact, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So let's stay on the family for a moment, go to the third generation. They were born fabulously wealthy. They were rich. They earned their fortune at the expense of millions of people who not only were addicted, but lost their lives as well. Not millions, but the hundreds of thousands I mentioned who lost their lives. And yet this third generation claims no link, that they're morally clean on this. I love the section of the book where you've got this Joss Sackler appearing now and then. I think she's an influencer or something. And they're just detached from this, but they were born with a fortune made from this. What do you think is the responsibility of the third generation?
So I thought a lot about this, and I should say that I think that this is an area in which reasonable people can differ. And my wife, who tends to read the pages as they're being written, she and I went back and forth a lot about this question, where just literally on questions of sort of my tone, and she maybe didn't always agree with. She may have felt that I was too severe at times in describing the third generation. I think here's my feeling. One of the themes I've always been fascinated with as a journalist, and this is actually another continuity between Say Nothing and Empire of Pain, is denial. Is that the stories that any community or individual or family might tell themselves about the moral decisions they've made, and a kind of and the capacity for self-delusion. And so if you're somebody who's born into a family and you come of age, as some of the people I describe in the book do, and you're an independent filmmaker, or you write code, or you deliver kind of keynote speeches about philanthropy and you sort of have this identity. You own a chain of restaurants in New York City. You have this identity, and you also have this trust with hundreds of millions of dollars in it that come from the sale of OxyContin. I was really struck by the fact that the attitude of a lot of these third generation Sacklers is, if I didn't work for the company and I wasn't on the board, it has nothing to do with me. There's a Sackler, a third generation Sackler, he's got a film financing fund. And he actually gave an interview to the Hollywood Reporter about a month ago, where he literally said the words, like, it has nothing to do with me, in a piece about his film financing fund, which is a fund of money that's his money, which, unless there's some big thing that I'm missing, it comes from the sale of OxyContin. That kind of disconnect, and the fact that so many of them can sustain it for so long was really intriguing to me. Does that mean that they're morally culpable in the way that Richard Sackler, who was running the company, is morally culpable? No, of course not. It's a continuum. But the notion that they are blameless, or that they should not be asked how they feel about the opioid crisis, to me, that's very hard to credit.
Yeah. Well, let's for a moment give the Sacklers their due on one argument. I want you to address this. They always said, as this was going on, as it started to become apparent that their drug was killing people all over America, that it was just a bunch of junkies who ruined their product. that they made a good product, a time-release product, opioid, instead of this high and low that you talk about, which was made it such a revolutionary thing. But it was these people who were already had physical failings or moral failings, whatever you want to call their addictive failings, who ruined their product. And yet we see how many of these people live in everyday America. It's one of the democratization of this thing. So take their argument at face value and tell me what you think of that. That it's not really their fault, it's the fault of these failed individuals who can't handle this medication.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that this is what I'll say. Of course, the Sacklers would not appreciate what I'm going to characterize as generosity here. But here's what I would say in a spirit of generosity toward them. I think greed is a very important element in this story, but I don't think it's the only element at all. And I think that there's something more subtle going on. And interestingly enough, to reprise our earlier exchange about Arthur, I think this is something that you see the roots of this in Arthur's life as well. There's a particular kind of stubborn blindness that I think is actually quite close to idealism, where you have a conjecture about something you're doing, and it's kind of a theory of the case, and you go out there and you do it. And then the world starts to tell you that you were wrong. And to me, the really interesting question is, what do you do when that happens? How do you process these signals coming to you, telling you that maybe you made a bet that was a bad bet? And so I think that there was actually a great deal of idealism in the development and kind of conception of OxyContin. I don't think the Sacklers set out to hurt people. Right. I think there was a genuine desire to ease terrible pain and make a lot of money at the same time. And almost immediately, there are these signals that come back that God, people are abusing the drug and they're overdosing on it and they're dying from it in some cases. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that the big question is, what do they say then? And I think another family, another company might have said, not let's pull the product from the shelves, but let's take a pause here and look at our marketing and see, maybe are we being too aggressive? Have we done anything wrong? And that never happened. Instead, they did, as you said, they kind of defaulted to this idea that there's really two kinds of people. There are legitimate pain patients who are prescribed the pills by doctors. They never get addicted. And then there are drug abusers who are just kind of reckless criminals. Richard Sackler called them the scum of the earth, who are electively abusing our drug. So there is some truth there's a kernel of truth in this, in the sense that when OxyContin was first introduced, it developed this reputation as hillbilly heroin. You could get it from a doctor, you could crush the pills, you could snort them, you could shoot them. There were people who were recreational drug users who might have been using other drugs if they weren't using OxyContin, for whom this became an appealing substitute. And on some level, I'd be more willing to have that conversation if the Sacklers and Purdue were prepared to do two things. One would be acknowledge that these people are not necessarily morally weak, and certainly you're making huge profits from them. I mean, there are a number of places in the book where I document the ways in which, if you're looking closely at the books of Purdue Pharma, the black market was driving a lot of their profits. And I think they knew it if they were looking closely at it. So don't go blaming those people too much when in fact they're generating a lot of revenue for you. But the other issue is that there were, right from the beginning, lots of people who took the pills exactly as the doctor ordered and became hooked. And so there was a kind of intrinsic quality of the pills. There's this sort of guns don't kill people, people kill people aspect of this, where the Sacklers have forever suggested it's all about individual choice. It's not about the product that we're selling. But there's a statistic at the end of the book that one insurance company made a filing with a bankruptcy court just quite recently. United Health did a study of how many people who who had that particular insurance had been prescribed OxyContin by a doctor and then diagnosed with an opioid use disorder. So presumably a smaller number than the number of people who are actually addicted. These are people who had a diagnosis. And they said they did this study and the number for this one insurance company was in the hundreds of thousands. So the notion that the representatives for the Sacklers told me as recently as a few months ago, it's vanishingly rare for people to get addicted when they take the drug in a doctor's care is very, very hard to square with the evidence.
Well, we didn't mention this, but one of the things they did was to make it sort of into a gummy bear so you couldn't crush it and snort it and say, okay, so now the problem is solved. People are not going to crush it and snort it. The hillbilly heroin thing is done. They'll have to take it as it's intended to be taken. But that didn't stop addiction. It said nothing about addiction at all. It only deprived them of being able to snort it like that.
Well, not only that, but we now know that what happened was because that happened so late in the game, there was this huge community of people who were already addicted. And a lot of those people just transitioned to heroin,
right,
to a more readily available substitute. But to go back to what I was saying earlier about how they knew their profits were based on this abuse, when they do that reformulation in 2010, they make the pill harder to grind and break up. Sales of the 80 milligram OxyContin pill, which is the biggest dose on the market, plummet 25% nationwide. And there's no way to read that other than that a quarter of their market was people who were abusing those pills for whom it became less attractive.
Right. So unfortunately, our time is drawing near us. So I've got one last question. You mentioned, and these are your words, so don't get mad at me. You said the ending is unsatisfactory in some ways of this book. It's a terrific book, so I wouldn't say it has a bad ending. Unsatisfactory in the sense that a reader wants justice. A reader wants the circle to be closed. A reader wants someone to pay for this because it is, there's an old line, behind every great fortune is a great tragedy. And this is a national tragedy. I mean, we all know someone in our circle of friends and loved ones who we've lost to this tragedy. I mean, most of us do. So I'll give it to you in the simplest terms possible. They moved all their money overseas. They hollowed out this great pharma. Are they going to get away with it?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I don't, part of, on the one hand, this book is very specifically about this family. On the other hand, it's about the country we live in and the systems and the way in which the very wealthy and powerful can play those systems and insulate themselves from any accountability for the decisions they make. So in the case of the Sacklers, I don't think you're ever going to see criminal charges against members of the family, even though they presided over this company that has pled guilty to criminal charges twice. I think in the final analysis, they will probably end up paying several $1 billion to help remediate the opioid crisis, while not acknowledging any personal wrongdoing whatsoever. They will probably be shielded from future suits. So, I think that if you're talking about any kind of basic definition of accountability, it's hard to suggest that they haven't gotten away with it. What I keep coming back to is that line by Isaac Sackler, the original patriarch, about how if you lose a fortune, you can always earn another, but you can never get your good name back. And I do think that that's a small thing, and my contribution here is a small contribution, but I do think that this is in part a story about the way in which marketing trumped truth for a long, long time. And one satisfaction that I think readers can take and that all of us can take from the outcome is that the Sacklers may outrun justice, but I don't think they can outrun truth.
That's terrific. I think we'll end on that note, folks. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Patrick, for coming, telling this really important story to our audience.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you all for coming.
It was an honor to host Patrick Radden Keefe in 2021 and to welcome him back on the podcast today. If you enjoyed listening, we welcome you to join us in person or virtually for our 37th season as we hear from authors like Percival Everett, Emma Donahue, Hanif Abdurraqib, and more. Get your tickets at lectures.org. Thank you to the Seattle Arts and Lectures staff, board, and community, and thanks to all of you for listening. Our show is produced by Jack Straw Cultural Center with theme music by Daniel Spills. To hear more, subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts, and while you're there, rate and review us 5 stars so that more people can enjoy Sal on Air.